experiences like going out to eat and traveling.
Yeah, that's a good point, because if you bought a lot of garden furniture, for instance, last year, it's not like you need to do that every month or even every year. I mean, it's a one-time item that probably isn't recurring the way that spending on services is. Now, in the past, we've seen big differences between what people say they're going to do and what people actually do. And I bring this up because we also got surveys that showed Americans are feeling pretty confident right now. How fragile or robust is that confidence? How do you determine whether there's a permanence to that confidence?
Well, I think there's always the potential for shocks, right, in financial markets, but also in people's lives. And we saw that last year with the pandemic. So right now, people are feeling much more confident, mainly because we've been able to control the virus somewhat. The vaccine distribution has rolled out to many adults in the U.S. So that is making people feel better about like their prospects for working potentially going forward, or the companies they already work for doing better over the next several months. And that encourages people to potentially feel comfortable spending rather than saving. Mm-hmm. But if we see a turn in the virus, which policymakers are certainly watching out for, that could change the way that people, feel confident. So I think right now we're definitely seeing a lot of the economic data come in strong, as you said, and that is bolstering people's confidence. But there is the overhang of the virus out there, and whether or not we could see a shift in people's confidence around the ability for not only our country, but for other countries to control it.
Yeah, that is a really important point. I mentioned GDP earlier. We actually got an initial read of how the economy performed in the January to March period, and it was pretty solid, up 6.7% in the first quarter. Consumer spending is certainly a big part of that, but also a big part of it is corporate earnings. Based on the corporate earnings that have been rolling in, what's the story they tell about the U.S. economy right now?
I think it's a lot like we're talking about in terms of consumer spending. So corporations last year got very conservative in terms of not understanding or knowing where the outlook was going to be for jobs or for how people would spend. And so they got conservative. We see that in some of the supply chain bottlenecks, that the demand came roaring back from consumers, in some cases faster than many companies and economists expected. So businesses' supplies were, low, and now we're seeing big demand. So certainly we're seeing companies do well because there's a lot more consumers going back into the market as we reopen and as they feel more confident. And so that's a good sign for company earnings, and it's showing up in the company earnings.
Last question to you, Peggy. With regard to the record 21% increase in personal income, it is pretty massive, but it makes sense because we have this massive government stimulus and a lot of unemployment aid in the system. What do we know about other sources of income, for instance, wage increases and how they're growing?
Well, that's a great point, Scarlett, because that's something that economists look at when they think about whether or not inflation will rise. So up until now, we really have not seen huge signs of wage inflation or big wage growth. But it's possible, as we do hear we do have some reporting of companies not being able to hire workers back fast enough. And we did have a lot of churn in the labor market. There's certainly millions of people who are still out of work, but there are a lot of people who changed jobs, and there are employers now who are trying to hire back fast, but having some trouble finding enough workers. And so whether or not we'll see wage growth because employers at restaurants, for example, have to pay more to get dishwashers or waitresses back to work, whether that will filter through to the economy in a way that's significant and drives up prices or inflation overall remains to be seen.
Got it. Peggy, really appreciate your breaking it down. And of course, we can look ahead to the jobs report for the month of March, or I should say the month of April. I've been getting all my dates mixed up, next Friday. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Maddie?
Scarlett, I'm so glad you just brought up wage increases, because despite the upbeat economic data, racial and gender inequalities have been exacerbated by COVID. Next up, Bloomberg's Shonali Basak and Romaine Bostick take a look at some of the alarming numbers.
In the late 1960s, the average white family had 5 times the wealth of an average black family in the U.S. By 2019, that gap grew 7 to 1. Today, black Americans hold less than 4% of the $116 trillion in U.S. wealth, with homeownership accounting for a lot of that shortfall.
It goes back to redlining. Banks and government agencies for many years gave out the riskiest ratings to predominantly black neighborhoods, keeping many families from getting affordable loans for their homes or for their businesses. But despite fair housing laws, racial disparities in home ownership, it's worsened in the last 25 years. At the same time, the gap in home values in white and predominantly non-white neighborhoods has increased. Then there's the gender pay gap. While economic disparities for women have narrowed since the 1970s, the gains have been slow and they remain precarious. During the COVID-19 pandemic, women, particularly women of color, have been hit hard by job losses in services industries. Many women have been pushed out of the workforce entirely. The number of women who want jobs but say that they're not seeking work due to family obligations, that's more than twice as high as comparable statistics for men.
These gaps have an impact on millions of people, and they take a dire toll on the broader economy. Bank of America says that with gender parity, global GDP could increase by $28 trillion by 2025. Unfortunately, at the current rate, it will take more than 250 years to close the economic divide. Meanwhile, in the U.S. alone, Citigroup estimates that the racial wealth gap has cost the country an estimated $16 trillion in lost economic output over the span of 2 decades.
Next Friday, Bloomberg TV will take a deep dive into money and equality. It will air at 7 p.m. Eastern Time. Let's get you some other headlines making news around the world. In Israel, growing calls for a public inquiry after a stampede at a Jewish religious festival killed at least 45 people. It's one of the deadliest civilian disasters in Israel's history and happened on what should have been a happy day on the calendar for the ultra-Orthodox community. Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has declared Sunday to be a national day of mourning. And the U.S. Embassy in Moscow says it will reduce visa and consular services to a minimum. That's following a Russian ban on hiring local staff. Russia imposed the new limits after the U.S. announced new sanctions and expelled 10 Russian diplomats. Russia's top diplomat, Sergei Lavrov, says the relations with the U.S. are even worse than during Cold War times. And tributes pouring in for South Africa's Zulu regent queen, Mantfombi Dlamini Zulu, who died just a month after assuming the role. Her husband, King Goodwill Zwelithini, had been the traditional ruler of the country's Zulu nation since 1971. Following his death last month, his wife was appointed regent pending the installation of a successor. No details of the cause of her death have been released. The Zulu are South Africa's largest ethnic group, accounting for more than a fifth of the country's 60 million citizens. For the latest news from your part of the world, go to Bloomberg.com, click on the Edition drop-down right next to the Bloomberg masthead, and choose your region. Scarlett?
Now, coming up after the break, the perception of progress. Your coworkers may not feel the same way you do about diversity efforts at your company. We'll explain when we're back in 2.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Discrimination is being called out at the corporate level. Boeing today said that it's fired 65 employees for racist or discriminatory conduct over the past year and disciplined dozens more. The plane maker also released a report breaking down the number of people of color and women in its ranks for the first time ever. And it revealed that nearly 70% of Boeing employees are white, blacks making up 6%. Hispanic representation marginally higher at about 7%, and Asians account for 14%. Companies say they want to do better to increase diversity, but it's become apparent there's little consensus on whether they're making actual progress. According to Glassdoor, Black employees are unsatisfied with their employer's diversity efforts. So to give us more insight into these findings is Daniel Zhao. He is senior economist at Glassdoor. Daniel, thank you so much for being here with us. Your research posed a very simple question, straightforward. Is your workplace diverse and inclusive? And the answer seems to be, it depends. So briefly explain what you found.
Well, we found that Black employees are 8% less satisfied with their company's D&I efforts than their white counterparts. And that's based on data from over 10,000 employees on Glassdoor. And so it really points to how Black employees are less satisfied, even though companies are now talking about investing in D&I more than ever.
The thing is, and we talked about this with Boeing, white employees make up the majority of that company's workforce, and also of the national workforce as well. Do we need to put an asterisk next to your results? Because does your research therefore underrepresent the minority voices that are out there?
Well, I think that our research actually delves deeper than what global averages will tell you. So it actually looks at what Black employees perceive about their company's D&I efforts and what white employees perceive, and shows that there is a difference there. And it really highlights that for companies, you can't have a one-size-fits-all approach to D&I. You need to actually make sure that you're understanding how underrepresented groups in particular feel about the workplace, and make sure that you're targeting any action and investment towards those groups specifically.
Okay, so let's dig into some of the specific findings. Where are these D&I perception gaps the starkest? Because you surveyed people across different industries, and apparently Black employees in the accounting and legal professions are not really feeling it.
So the three industries with the largest gaps were accounting and legal, travel and tourism, and consumer services. I actually think what's interesting here is that some of these industries are ones that are poised for a post-pandemic rebound. So in particular, travel and tourism and consumer services are going to see a large increase in demand as in-person services open up. And so these are industries where there are going to be a lot of job opportunities, but there are also places where employers need to do better in order to make sure that their employees feel like they're in a diverse and inclusive workplace. But I actually think the most interesting thing about the industry data is not which industry has the largest gap right now, but the fact that these gaps are actually pervasive and consistent across industries, and really highlights how this is a systemic issue facing employers across the economy.
Right. So has it changed since, say, last summer over time as companies have started to slowly wake up to the fact that they need to do more on the D&I front?
So we've actually seen that this gap has actually widened slightly over the last 2 years. And so that might be a surprise to people who have recognized